The Great HEMA War of 2024 has begun, and it's all about whether your sword should be heavy or light. Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now I'm going to try and keep this relatively concise. In the last few days there has been, some people would call it drama online in the HEMA community. Now what is the HEMA community? That's Historical European Martial Arts. That is all of us who run clubs and events and tournaments, competitions, sparring days, whatever, all over the world that study basically historical European martial arts. That is historical fencing, archaic ways of using weapons, not just swords, but also pole arms and daggers and everything like that. And we study it from treatises. I'm sure any regular viewer of this channel will know that only too well, but just in case you're new to the channel. Now, those of us who've been running events and clubs and sparring competitions over the years have developed various different training tools. I've developed various different training tools. Many of you will know that over the years I've worked with Regnier Armory, I've worked with Averted Armory and other companies as well. And fundamentally, the most popular form of HEMA fencing in the world today is longsword. Now, it used to be vastly more popular than everything else, but actually certain things have started to catch up, particularly sabre and also rapier, I would say, as well. So in some countries, rapier's really, really huge. In other countries, not so much. In some countries, sabres are really, really huge. In the UK, it's pretty big. In other countries, not so much. But nevertheless, longsword remains the most popular HEMA fencing weapon because, you know, frankly, they look cool. But you might be thinking, Matt, you're not holding a longsword, you're holding something weird looking, and it is something weird looking. Very briefly, for anyone who doesn't know, what I'm holding is commonly known these days as a feder or federschwert. Ironically, they probably weren't ever known as that in the time that they were used, the 15th, 16th century. They were probably known as a paratschwert, a parade sword, and they were used by fencing guilds primarily in the Holy Roman Empire and some neighbouring areas. So this is the training sword that you will see in lots of the German fencing treatises of the 15th and 16th century, like Joachim Meyer and things like that. And these were used in the fencing guilds and they were used for competitive purposes. They weren't used in the same way as we use them today. So first of all, they didn't have fencing masks, they didn't put on loads of protective gear, and they didn't just hit each other as hard as possible, probably most of the time. And in some cases, they weren't allowed to thrust. For example, if we look at Joachim Meyer, it seems that these actually were used predominantly for striking with the flat, and this is preserved in the Belgian Fencing Guild rules, which continued all the way into the 18th century, and my friend Matt Gallas has done lots of research on. And they have very specific rules, and there were a lot of competitions where you were striking with the flat of the blade to the head to try and produce basically a bloom, a bleeding wound on the top of the head, very similar to the British single stick rules, whereby that was how the fight was decided, by getting a bleeding gash or wound on the skull of your opponent. Clearly a disadvantage if you don't have any natural protection to the top of your head there. So very different to what we do today. What we do today in longsword fencing is actually in many ways more akin in some ways to modern fencing or Victorian sabre fencing or bayonet fencing. We put on a fencing mask, we put on padded jackets, we put on big gloves, and we twat each other really hard with the edges of these feder, and we usually have thrusting safe tips, so we thrust and we cut with them, we look for good edge alignment. We were actually using it in quite a different way to the ways that feder were probably being used historically. And it's also important to note that these were only the practice versions of longswords in the Holy Roman Empire and neighbouring areas, most notably the Netherlands and Belgium. They weren't, as far as we know, used in England, France, Spain, Italy. What did they use there? They did use things. They probably used things more like this, which is essentially just a blunt, rebated and flexible fencing sword. This is a sword that I have been working on with Caveton. More news about that very soon, because I practice Fiore, and there's no evidence at all that, you know, Fiore, Vardi, Morozzo, anyone like that was using anything like a feder. They were using some type of blunt sword. They were using blunt swords, they definitely had them. Blunt swords are also mentioned in English and French sources, but they didn't look like a feder. Right, so what's this all about? So in the last week or so, I think probably a couple of weeks actually, it's been announced that a particular company, and I'm not going to get into companies and what different people are doing here, have developed a light fencing feather. What's the problem with that? For me personally, no problem at all. So here's the fundamental thing. Some people have really got their, as we would say, got their knickers in a twist over the fact that some people are pushing for lighter fencing weapons and some people are pushing for, in some cases, heavier or longer fencing weapons. So when we create competitions or tournaments, there has to be a degree of parameters defined in the rules of the tournament. Okay, clearly, if if people were turning up to a longsword competition with something the size of a montante, that wouldn't be very fair. It also wouldn't be very safe either, because we can't really fence with those things, because if you hit people with one of these, they tend to die quite a lot, okay, or at least get broken limbs quite easily. So you can make a blunt and flexible one of those, but because of its size and weight, it hits like a freight train. So clearly there are some parameters, and some people have been pushing for lighter weapons, perhaps inspired by modern Olympic-style FIE fencing, and safety and not having to wear perhaps so much gear. Some people have pushed for flexibility rules, so all weapons, all feather are subject to different flexibility. So if you essentially apply weight to it, how much weight does it take to make it flex? Obviously that's very important for thrusting. It also has some effect on cutting as well, where the edge alignment isn't very good. You do find that on average stiffer blades seem to hit a bit harder, but that's also partly because they tend to have more mass up here, so they hit with more inertia. Now, so in the last few days, various people have been arguing over we should have lighter feather or we should have heavier feather, we should have shorter feather, we should have longer feather. Look, my view is this. So I try to be as impartial as possible, but actually my view is applicable to an impartial standpoint here. Use what you want to use, so long as it's safe, so long as it's not harming your training partners, or so long as it fits the goal of the tournament that you're organising or whatever. You just set the parameters as you like. There's no reason to get your knickers in a twist over this. If you want to use a light feather, use a light feather, but don't try and make everybody else use a light feather, okay? Because not everyone else wants to. If someone's practicing, let's say, Vardi or Marozzo, they need a particularly, quite a long sword. If someone's practicing Fiore, you can do it with lots of different types of swords, and sometimes quite short ones work quite well. There are certain systems which are intended to work with a certain type of weapon. That should be obvious. You don't, if you want to use a saber, you don't go and study a rapier treatise. You study a saber treatise. So there are different systems for different types of weapons. So you pick the type of simulator that fits your, your system. But some people have argued, let's just pick up a Siggy feather for example. Some people have argued that there are lots of the advantages for having lighter feathers are worth everybody using lighter feathers because they're safer. They mean that people of less stature, less physical kind of size or whatever are on maybe a more even footing or less likely to get injured. Yeah, those things can be true. Okay, so the advantages of using a lighter sword are that, yes, you're probably on average going to get less injuries. I'll come back to that in a second. And it also lowers the kind of bar or threshold for engagement in that particular activity. So clearly people who are, weaker or smaller can more comfortably use that object. So there are advantages to using a lighter weapon. Historically, there were also advantages given. So if we look at the Italian saber treatises of the late 19th century, Rodelli's kind of lot, one of the quoted advantages of using a lighter sword for fencing and training is you can train for longer. So it basically increases the amount of time that you can fence for or drill for, and this is advantageous because you get more time on the mats, you get more time training. Okay, so definitely that's an advantage. And another advantage which is quoted in the early 20th century when they were changing sport fencing weapons, and sabres in particular were getting lighter, so that the first Olympics, sabres could be up to 700 grams, and then quite rapidly it came down to about 500 grams. And one of the advantages was that it made the fight a bit quicker, which they preferred aesthetically, but also it meant you could wear a lot less gear, you could wear lighter jackets, lighter gloves, you got less broken fingers, less concussions and things like this. So definitely there are advantages to using lighter weapons. However, There are also advantages to using heavier weapons. Now, I would argue, and I think a lot of other people would argue, that if you're using a weapon that's the same weight as the original that you're simulating, so if your longsword feather roughly balances about the same and has a roughly similar weight, it can be a bit under, or it can be a bit more balanced towards the hand, it's going to move in a similar way to the original object that you are simulating, okay? Now, obviously, we're never 100% simulating real combat with sharp swords. We know that. The edges are blunt. They react differently to sharp edges. The weapon's slightly different. You don't have the psychology of a real fight. You're wearing protective gear, blah, blah, blah. We know that, okay? But if your weapon moves in a roughly similar way to the weapon that you're simulating, then it will move in a similar sort of tempo. It will have similar handling characteristics. It will end up in a similar percentage of sort of, grappling, closing, disarming techniques. The bind will function in similar ways. When you start to make the weapon very much more flexible or very much more light, it doesn't behave like that anymore. We know that. We know that from, if you take an extreme example, a LARP sword. A LARP sword does not move or react like a real sword. Now, they are fun things to use and you can learn things from them. You can use them for training beginners and stuff, but they are never as good at simulating a sword fight as something that's similar to a real sword. Okay, so that's important to say. But again, my personal point of view. So in my club, we use modern sporting weapons. We use foil épée and sporting sabres for certain types of training. We also use accurately weighted real sabres, like the Coveton Easton sabre, which I developed, which is the same weight and the same balance as the real sabre that we are training for and the system that we use. We use, for longswords, we use nylon swords, we use steel feathers, we use rebated blunt swords that are even more like swords than the feather. Sometimes we use LARP weapons, we use other forms of padded weapons, we use what we call boffers. Particularly for beginners, getting people into sparring, they are fantastic. So I'm not against any of those, but you have to be aware of the limitations of any of these simulators, and that goes even for the super realistic ones. There are limitations to those as well, because very often you have to apply more control or wear more gear with these than you might do with, obviously, with something like a LARP sword or a modern fencing weapon. So those are forms of limitation as well. So look, different tools for different jobs. Some tools are fantastic for training one particular way, other tools are fantastic for training another particular way. Now, before I wrap this up, I just want to say one thing that has bugged me slightly in this whole discourse, and that is there's been some claims made about the historical original feather. Now look, the fact is this, and Jamie McAvoy actually said this really well. If we look at original swords or we look at original feather, there's actually a huge variation. So saying that they are all like this or they are all like that, and therefore justifying our modern sporting and recreational choices based on the history, that's misguided, because there's a huge amount of variation in the originals. And also bear in mind that the feather, we only have, a couple of dozen of them surviving in the world known. There's a tiny data set to work from. And even within that tiny data set, there's a huge variation, okay? I happen to have here, here's an example from VB Sword Shop. This is a replica of a feather that's from Italy, although it's probably of German origin. It's in Italy. And this thing I've talked about on the channel before, and it's a beast. This thing's massive and hits like a freight train. You've got to train, you've got to either drill or spar with this in a very different, it moves in a different way. It hits like a sledgehammer. This thing is a really, really different beast to a standard modern tournament feather. Okay, and that is a big, heavy one. So, don't think that by making modern sporting feather lighter for our modern sporting purposes, don't think you can justify that with historical sort of facts, because you can't really. It's just a modern choice, because we're not fencing in the same way and we're not using the tools in the same way. Yes, there are some in Switzerland, there's some quite light feather, but if you look other places, there's some quite heavy ones. I've got another replica of yet another original here, and this one is pretty similar really in handling to the VB. It's actually a little bit lighter than the VB Sword Shop one, but this is a big, massive, heavy spatulate tip, no roll tips, not even thickened tips. Some of the tips on the originals are really thin. These hit freaking hard, and you've got to train with them quite carefully. So if we look at whether it's original sharp swords or original training swords, there's a big variation in size, in weight, in balance, but overall, most of the originals, I think, are probably heavier than your average modern sporting feather. And that's not a criticism, because the average modern sporting feather is invented for the modern sport of longsword HEMA fencing, with fencing masks and all the modern training gear that we use and different rules that we use. We are not, for the most part, using historical longsword fencing rules. We are not using historical fencing gear, because we're wearing fencing masks and we're hitting to the head in a completely different way. And we're not even using the tools in the same way, because we're hitting with the edge instead of the flat, and we're thrusting. So we're doing a different activity. Now, that's not a criticism. What we're doing is great. It's actually quite similar to other forms of fencing that was practiced historically, certain types of rapier fencing once masks came in, certainly small sword, sabre, backsword, bayonet. Similar to that, but what we're trying to do is we're applying longsword systems and methodology with a modified historical tool that's from the Holy Roman Empire only, and we're using it to a different set of rules for the most part. We do learn an awful lot about the historical treatises and reconstructing them and practicing and training them. It's a great activity, but don't fool yourself and think that it's exactly the same as what they were doing in the 15th century, because it's not. Right, so there we go. Overall, the conclusion is, if you want to use a light feather, use a light feather. Don't try and force everybody else to necessarily. If you want to run a competition with a light feather, do it. If you want to use longer, heavier feather, or you want to use more flexible feather, do it. It will have consequences. If you change the weapon, you change the rules, you will get different results. My personal opinion is that if you're essentially reinventing FIE fencing for longsword, which some people want to do, not necessarily a fan of that myself, but if you want to do it and that's fun, then do it. It's no skin off my nose. But if you want to reinvent essentially épée with longswords, I warn you, I give you this message. You will end up with people fencing like épée with very light longswords. People will optimize the longest, lightest, noodliest version of a longsword they can get. They will fence almost entirely right foot forward, and they will basically end up doing épée fencing. That's what I suspect. I might be wrong. If in 20 years' time this has happened and I was wrong, that's fine. Okay, I'm happy to be proven wrong. But there we go. I think that's what the end goal is. Think about what the end of the route might be. If we do all of these things, what will be the end result? It might be that. That might not be actually what we're aiming for. So think about where you want to get to, and think about how you get to the destination. Anyway, I hope this has been interesting. This is obviously a video mostly for the actual HEMA practitioners out there, the people who are actually going to clubs and training or competing and fencing. But it might be of interest to some of the other viewers on this channel who have a general interest in the activity. And of course, we've covered a little bit of the history of these things here, which you see on this channel quite a bit, and you might have wondered what the hell they are with these weird bits and that kind of stuff. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. I hope to see you back on the channel really soon. I'm Matt Easton, and you'll see me again really soon. Cheers, folks.